Oh, brother, where to start? All right, let's be succinct about this. First, when we say that Francis, and let's just only use Francis here because he is the currently reigning and most blatantly anti-Catholic papal claimant in Rome, and Salza defends even him as a true pope. When we say that Francis is guilty of the sin of heresy, it is not by private judgment that we do so, because private judgment would imply that we are using some sort of subjective, un-Catholic standard by which we arrive at a conclusion that is not certain, but simply an opinion. That is what is meant by the term private judgment, and we'll talk more about that later on and prove that. So, private judgment is not what is happening here. Rather, the judgment involved in saying that Francis is a public heretic is obviously a cognitive judgment, and in this sense, it is the judgment of individuals, it is true, but that doesn't make it a subjective judgment necessarily, nor does it mean it could reasonably be wrong, because the human mind is quite capable of making objective and certain judgments, sometimes even infallible judgments. And to deny that would actually amount to modernism, because the modernists are the ones who claim that the human mind is incapable of attaining objective truth. So, Salza is just blowing smoke here to confuse the issue by briefly introducing the term private judgment, hoping that his listeners will assume it means it's just subjective opinion, but that's false. And speaking of private judgment, by the way, let's just use Salza's own definition of private judgment here for a minute, okay? Defined as any sort of judgment that isn't rendered by the competent ecclesiastical authority. Let's go with that definition for a second. How is it that for Salza and the whole Recognize and Resist gang who agree with him, how is it that they can reject the new Mass and Vatican II as not Catholic? How can they reject the 1983 Code of Canon Law, the Novus Ordo Saints, the 1993 Ecumenical Directory, and so on? Isn't that just their private judgment? I mean, it's certainly not the judgment of their church, which has repeatedly said the opposite. So, who's the one engaging in private judgment here, if we're taking the Salza definition of private judgment? The Sedevacantists position at least makes sense. We don't submit to Francis because we don't believe he's the Pope. And if we believed he was the Pope, we would submit to him. But these resistance guys have a total mess. And this is what John Salza says.
The Sedevacantism is really a form of Protestantism. It ultimately relies upon private judgment. There can be no unity based on private judgment, and that's why you see that Sedevacantists disagree with each other, just like the Protestants.
We'll interrupt here for a second just to refute the silly private judgment accusation. And remember, we already talked about that a little bit earlier. John Daly blew that whole private judgment thing out of the water back in 1989, okay? And if Salza had done his research, he would have seen it. And we're linking Daly's article taken from his book Refuting Michael Davies in the show notes. He republished the book, John Daly did, in a second edition in 2015, and now the entire book is available electronically for free online at our website, or you can purchase it as a paperback copy. Anyway, Daly refutes the private judgment objection at length, but I'd like to just give you a quick summary here. The private judgment that the Catholic Church condemns and that we find in Protestantism is not the cognitive reasoning that takes place when the mind takes a Catholic principle and applies it to a concrete case at hand, as John Salza would have you believe. Rather, it's the kind of judgment that is based on a subjective, non-Catholic criterion in opposition to that given by the Church. The great 19th century American Catholic writer Orestes Brownson summed it up beautifully in the following paragraph, which is quoted by John Daly. Quote, "Here is the error of our Protestant friends. They recognize no distinction between reason and private judgment. Reason is common to all men. Private judgment is the special act of an individual. In all matters of this sort, there is a criterion of certainty beyond the individual, and evidence is adducible which ought to convince the reason of every man, and which, when adduced, does convince every man of ordinary understanding, unless through his own fault. Private judgment is not so called because it is a judgment of an individual, but because it is a judgment rendered by virtue of a private rule or principle of judgment. The distinction here is sufficiently obvious, and from it we may conclude that nothing is to be termed private judgment which is demonstrable from reason or provable from testimony." Unquote. And that is from Orestes Brownson's Quarterly Review, October 1852, pages 482 and 483. And once again, that is quoted also by John Daly, and you can find that in our show notes. So these are the facts concerning the nature of private judgment.